Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to Sporty's webinar series. Tonight's topic, we're talking everything related to check rides, which is kind of a universal concept in aviation. It affects us all. So as you might expect, we have a really full classroom, which is wonderful because we have some industry experts on with us tonight as part of our panel discussion. So as you may have gathered from the description and as you registered for tonight, this is not the traditional webinar presentation where you're going to hear a lot of lecturing or talking or even looking at slides. This is going to be more of an open forum. So I want to say thanks first and foremost to everyone who ahead of the presentation has been able to submit your questions via email. We have a lot of great questions to start with, and please feel free throughout the presentation to continue to send those in via the GoToWebinar platform. I am Eric Radke. I serve as the president of Sporty's Academy and also chief instructor and also program director for the University of Cincinnati's aviation program. I'm kind of doing double duty tonight. I'm serving as predominantly your facilitator for this evening because the real folks you want to listen to are part of this panel, but I will occasionally jump in from time to time on a few of the questions that are coming in this evening. Your panel for this evening in kind of alphabetical order. We have Jason Blair. Jason, thanks for being here. Jason is a designated pilot examiner, does a high volume of check rides up in that southwestern Michigan area, a lot for the Western Michigan program. If you're not following along with Jason Blair at jasonblair.net, you definitely want to do that. He's a lot of great videos related to check ride prep. Jason's previously served as executive director of the National Association of Flight Instructors, NAFI. Jason, welcome. Good evening. What is going on? What is going on in Southwest Michigan?
You know, it was actually 2 check rides earlier today, and well, I guess I should say 1.5. The weather scratched the second half of the second one, which was, that shows an applicant making a good decision when we got thunderstorms coming. So that's what we like to see. But we'll try and pick that one up for them and have some better weather here in the next couple of days. So yeah, it's check ride season, what we call it up here. When the winter goes away, we start doing lots of rides and catching back up. So we like this summer season.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate you taking some time away from a busy check ride schedule to join us tonight. Mr. Eric Crump, welcome. Eric is with us, director of the Aerospace program at Polk State College down in Lakeland, Florida, formerly chief instructor at Gleim Publications. And Eric, I'll also mention, is an active member of an FAA industry working group that is tasked with the Airman Certification Standards implementation. And I know we have a lot of folks in the classroom tonight and who have submitted questions ahead of time that are interested in ACS. Eric, welcome. Good evening from down in Florida. How are things?
Well, it's rainy, as it's been for the last 2 weeks. We've been dealing with our first named storm, and it's not even June yet, so that probably doesn't bode well for the rest of the summer for us. But besides the rain, it's good. Very, very busy, but exciting. We like the summer too. It's actually when it slows down for us, so it's exact opposite of Jason's life right now. So we actually get a little bit of time to get some breathing done. Yeah, very excited to join tonight and to hopefully shed some light on ACS related questions and where the thing came from and where it's going.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. And yes, I understand in the collegiate world, the summer slows down, but no doubt you will be gearing up for a very busy fall with so many interested individuals in kind of the professional aviation right now and the big job growth we're seeing in the airlines. So thanks for taking some time.
Yeah, let's not talk about fall yet, Eric. We're not talking about that.
That's right. Let's take a breather.
We're pretending it's not going to happen right now.
Delighted to have with us also Mr. Todd Ritchie. Mr. Ritchie is the I would describe him as the most prolific designated pilot examiner in the Southwest Ohio area. In addition to his teaching and DPE responsibilities, Todd also is a full-time corporate pilot. So Todd is juggling, like so many of us in aviation, a lot of different full-time jobs, but flies about every piece of equipment you can imagine, from single engine trainers up to jet aircraft in the corporate world. Todd, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Eric, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. This is my first webinar, so I'm excited to be with you guys, and hopefully this will benefit some of our listeners tonight. And I'm hoping to learn a couple things too. I would consider myself maybe a little bit of a new DPE. I've only been doing it for a couple of years, so hopefully this is beneficial to our listeners tonight, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Todd. A couple of housekeeping items before we get into your questions and the panel discussion we have planned. Our presentation this evening is being recorded, so if you have to step away, if your audio glitches, anything like that, and you want to come back and listen to a particular topic or discussion, you can do that. Unlimited amount of times. It's going to be available within about 24 hours. It'll be available by the end of the day tomorrow, essentially. You can come back and view that at sporties.com/webinars, and it will also be available on the Sporties YouTube channel. If you follow Sporties Pilot Shop on Facebook or Twitter, which if you're not, you absolutely should, it'll get pushed out via those social media channels as well, so you'll be able to see it as soon as it is available. And while you're there at sporties.com/webinars, do check back for any future presentations. We do these on approximately every month to 6-week basis on a variety of different topics, so we'd be happy to have you back on a future presentation. And again, as a reminder, you'll have the opportunity, if you haven't submitted questions already, not that we'll be able to necessarily get to everything, but more the better, please submit those via the GoToWebinar software, and we'll do our absolute best to put those questions before our panel. Now, to help me as a facilitator, to help our panel that's with us this evening, I'd like to start with a question for the audience, just to kind of give us a gauge on what the experience level is on our audience tonight, whether or not you've have a Checkride under your belt, whether you're gearing up for one now, whether you're fairly new and you just want to know all there is to know. So we're going to launch this via the platform and give everyone just a moment to get their answer choices submitted. And it looks like in early voting, we have about half have not taken a Checkride, but have one coming up. So Jason, to your point, it's Checkride season, and that's what folks are gearing up for. About a quarter of our audience has completed at least one Checkride, and another quarter are not going to have a Checkride for a while, but they are interested in getting as much insight as they possibly can. So that's kind of the breakdown. So thanks for everyone who's participated in the poll, of course. Before we get to our first question, by virtue of the full classroom, by virtue of all the questions, do know that you are certainly not alone. If there's some nervousness, a feeling that you're not quite ready or not quite prepared, that's very normal. All of us go through it. You listen to all the introductions. To be a DPE, to be a collegiate aviation program director, we all started out as pilots. We've all been through the first solo. We've all been through that initial Checkride, and all of us, I think, on this panel have been through now multiple Checkrides since. And gosh, especially if you're on a professional pilot track, you have a lot more to go. So it's again a universal concept in aviation. We all were there first, and hopefully that will be a point I think that our entire panel will agree with, that we know what it's like. You know, we've been there. They're not there. They're there to just make sure that you can kind of demonstrate and put your best foot forward and do everything that you and your instructor decided you were ready to do when that endorsement was placed in that pilot logbook. So you're not alone. We're all in this together. We also know kind of universally that there's always a bit of mystery or intrigue behind the Checkride, a little bit of that unknown. And that universal rule in life I was always taught, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you read. I really think that rings true when it comes to Checkride time. There's a lot of rumors that can be passed around, and a lot of these can kind of be defined in that category of even folklore at some point. So make sure you stick to what's known. Certainly if you have reliable sources, which would start with your flight instructor and maybe some peers that you're coming through the training course with, those would be definitely good sources of information, but certainly don't believe everything that's out there associated with Checkrides. And we know, in this Checkride situation, it's very one-on-one. The microscope, the spotlight is definitely on you, and that might be the first time in life that you've experienced something like that. So with all this good feedback we're going to get from this panel tonight, we're going to help settle everyone's nerve. So to kick us off, let's we mentioned Airman Certification Standards, which is still a relatively new concept. I would describe it as such when it comes to the certification licensing of airmen. I'd like to give Eric Crump, if I could, just a moment to talk to us a little bit about where ACS stemmed from, what was the impetus behind the change or shift from practical test standards over to ACS, and then maybe Eric, you could also conclude with kind of what the status is in terms of which certifications Checkrides are now on the ACS system and what's coming down the pipe there. So Eric, take it away.
Sure. Well, thanks, Eric. The ACS concept was really born out of the fact that we in the training industry never really had insight into what the FAA was doing from the regulatory side. So the FAA would just release a practical test standard or release an update to a knowledge test. They didn't tell anybody that you had to know. And you could actually show up for a check ride with one version of the PTS when your pilot examiner was using an updated version because you didn't know and your instructor didn't know. And so these issues had existed for a long time, but then we'd really gotten to a place, particularly in knowledge testing, where people were really just buying resources to memorize the answers to the questions, because for a long time the FAA had put the knowledge test questions out in the public domain. They stopped doing that, but again, they didn't tell anybody. So the general public still thought, and this was 2001, 2002, when those questions were taken out of the public domain. So the general public still thought that they were buying a test preparation guide, and really all they had to do was just memorize the answers to those questions, and they were going to get a super high score on the knowledge test. And what really happened was that the knowledge test particularly started to depart very rapidly from, well, how do you say that politely, from what you really needed to know to be a safe and competent pilot, and really started being an academic exercise. And, you know, could you memorize some obscure content in an FAA resource publication? And so we went to the FAAs in the industry and said, you know what, let's actually do this together. Let's find a way to work together. So the FAA chartered an ARC, an Aviation Rulemaking Committee, to determine if there was a need for a change, which, I mean, I think we all pretty much knew that there was a need for a change, but we sort of had to prove it to ourselves. And really our first ask was, listen, we have this practical test standard document, and it's not great, but it's okay. It does a thing. Let's build a knowledge test standard. Let's build a standards document to tell the FAA who's writing the test questions, the applicants who are taking the test, the instructors who are preparing the applicants, what the knowledge test is supposed to be, so that you knew what to study and you weren't reading every word hoping that you could, you know, pick up this useful content. What we realized as we got into having that conversation is that we were still, knowledge training and knowledge testing was still separate and apart from taking the practical test, which is not what any of us wanted. And from that epiphany came the Airman Certification Standard, which was one document that would contain all of the knowledge that you needed to know, all of the skills that you had to be able to demonstrate, and this new super mysterious concept called risk management, which was how to do all that and be safe at the same time. And that was the birth of the ACS. And believe it or not, that was 6 years ago. Over the time that those initial conversations happened and we started trying to figure out what would an ACS look like, we also developed the plan of prototyping these documents, because the FAA would release PTSs, and again, you just sort of had to deal with it because that was the new document. Prototyping meant that we were going to take an ACS that we had developed and vetted and that we had received public comment on, and we were actually going to take it out into the field and let applicants try it, let DPEs try it, instructors try it out, and provide feedback on if it works and how it could be improved. We would try it first before we implemented it. And so we did that. We released the private ACS, the instrument ACS, and now the commercial ACS is out and on the street. And so it's really rewarding now, 6 years later, to look at the industry and see the positive changes that have come about because of the ACS. Taking knowledge tests now is a much more realistic and practical exercise than it used to be, and that will only continue to get better as better questions are written to map to this knowledge standard that we have now. And in terms of where we're going, the major project for my group right now in the prototyping world, that's my primary role. I manage prototyping efforts for the ACS documents that we develop. We're starting to test the instructor ACS. So people ask all the time, when are we going to have a flight instructor ACS? And that's a great question, and we certainly need one. The flight instructor standards really haven't been revised at all in the last 3 years, and really not substantively in the last 6. So there's a lot that can be done and improved there, and we're prototyping that document now. Certainly hoping to have it out in 2019. That would be the goal. We still have to get it out in the field for applicants to try it and test it out, because that's important. Obviously, we're in the process of building the ATP ACS now, which is a huge undertaking, as I'm sure Eric deals with on a regular basis. It's a gargantuan document, but it's an important effort. So that's a really long answer to a short question, but that's sort of the boiled down history of the ACS and what to expect next.
Eric, thanks for that background. Let me move to Todd Ritchie for a second. Todd, having seen the transition in many of the certifications, private, instrument, commercial, from the traditional PTS over to ACS, what's kind of your perspective on how the Checkride scenario has changed, been modified? Has it fundamentally changed at all? What would be kind of your perspective on that?
I think from an evaluator or an examiner perspective, I don't think it's changed a whole lot as far as the requirements that I'm looking for on a Checkride. I think it's definitely a step in the right direction as far as the format goes. I think it's easier to read and understand. That's my opinion, and I'm on the examiner side. I'm not on the applicant side, so that may be a different opinion. Change is always hard. PTS was around for many, many years, and that's what we were all used to. So I think it's human nature to be a little bit hesitant on change, but I think it's definitely a good thing. And as far as the plan of action that I have to come up with to do a Checkride, there's really not a whole lot of difference. It's more of maybe a scenario-based type Checkride now. If you read the ACS, it's kind of written that way. It starts pre-flight and it takes you through a logical flight, which I think is very beneficial and easy to follow. So I'm looking forward to everything being ACS, and it just takes a little while to get used to, I think, for everyone, but definitely a good thing in my opinion.
Jason Blair, what kind of the same question over to you? What your take? Is it fundamental change in how you're kind of administering Checkrides, or what the applicant can expect?
There really hasn't been for me, and I'm going to preface this with the fact that I'm pretty darn biased. Eric and I worked on some of those initial work groups that developed the ACS, so I've been a fan and an assistant developer in the early stages of this process, even as we first identified some of the challenges in the knowledge test that we had. And I think what really the important piece is what we've been able to see happen with the ACS is the content that's in the practical test and the knowledge tests are directly derived and resourced from the documents that applicants are going to be used, whether that be the Federal Aviation Regulations or the Airplane Flying Handbook or the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, instead of where we historically had an aggregation of data through the industry that came from multiple documents. We have resourced this material, and we're able to give the applicant, if they take the time, and their instructor, if they take the time to look at the resources that are referenced in that ACS, the specific locations that the standards and the expectations for those maneuvers that are going to happen on a practical test are going to come from. In the best advice I can give somebody on a Checkride about an ACS usage or preparation is that is our menu as an examiner. We don't get to order sushi at the Italian restaurant. So if we're doing a private pilot test, we're using a private pilot ACS. And if you've taken the time as an instructor and as an applicant to go through that material, resourced some reference materials that are in that and are noted in the sections of the ACS, you are going to be prepared for that Checkride, because that's exactly what we have to follow as the examiner. And I think it has just clarified exactly what's going to be on a practical test, not only for the examiner giving it, but for the CFI preparing their applicant and for the applicant to know exactly what to expect on that check ride. So I think it has really done a great job to standardize it if somebody takes the time to look at what it's going to be built of when we give that check ride.
Yeah, so in other words, it's it's not cheating. In fact, you're advocating for the fact that you want to go read the playbook. You want to see the menu right ahead of time before going to the restaurant, so to speak, to stick on the analogy. So, I mean, I guess word to the wise, make sure that's a document you're familiar with. I'm not going to ask any of the DPEs on to respond to this question, but I'm certain that they probably have had applicants that come and are not familiar or not even aware this document exists. The standards are going to be held, so certainly do your homework there for sure. A common theme. A lot of the questions that were submitted could kind of fit into this category. And let me stick with Jason for just a moment here. And that's related to best resources and methods for Checkride prep. And I have a strong suspicion that there are some that submitted questions that are really expecting to kind of hear like a silver bullet, like maybe a single resource, and ACS is definitely a big part of that. But can you, I guess, describe for me what you would, for some of your students taking your DPE hat off for a second, what are you recommended for that kind of final stretch up until check ride time in terms of their preparation?
There's a lot of fantastic resources out there, and I think one of the most common ones that I see people using is actually a product that Sporty sells from ASA. It's the oral exam guides. You see these little books that are, kind of purposefully followed by a lot of different people as they're getting ready for their check ride, and it's a great resource. It's kind of a summarizing review of materials, but I'm going to tell you that's not everything an examiner asks. Matter of fact, I think Todd probably does the same thing. A lot of times I'll see somebody with that book and make sure I start making sure my questions stray away from the basic ones in there, just because I know that, if that's all they've studied, I want to make sure their knowledge base is gone a little bit further. But there's a lot of fantastic online resources, even things like this. I know, Eric, we've done previous webinars on, how to pass your check ride, things that we see common failures on. And I will absolutely tell an applicant, before I start giving you a check ride and asking questions, I can answer any you want. So if you want to ask an examiner a question ahead, if you want to go online, watch some webinars about these, read articles that examiners have written, whether it's the one you're going to be taking the check ride with or other ones. There's no rocket science here. This is not something that we're trying to hide. Matter of fact, we don't care why you learn the information. If you learned it because your instructor said, I know this examiner likes to ask, about ADs or minimum equipment lists, and they're on every check ride. Well, darn it, you better start learning that, because it's going to be there. And we're not really worried about why you learned it as much as we are that you learned the content. So, reaching out, looking, doing some searching on articles on check ride passing. Obviously, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association has a whole bunch of resources out there as well. And there's some fantastic publishers and content providers. Look to those. All these companies that do this for you to make yourself more successful. Use those resources. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. So, and definitely do it at least, a little further out than the night before the check ride. Take some time to prepare for that, and that we get a chance to really learn the information.
Eric Crump, so a lot of students I know that you're involved with and supervise down at Polk State. Are there some common resources or resources that you tell students to avoid, or you absolutely advocate for? What would be your response to those resources for check ride prep?
I think, particularly in a Part 141 training environment, students have a unique advantage because they have the ability to fly with multiple instructors, to go through stage checks, to be evaluated throughout the course of training, so that the check ride is not the first time someone other than their instructor has evaluated them. And in the Part 61 world, or I did my private Part 61, everything after that was in a 141 school. So they're two totally different methods of evaluation, because all my evaluation in my private training came from my primary instructor, who, in my particular case, I started flying when I was 13, sold on my 16th birthday, finally finished my private 3 days before I moved to college. So, I was with this guy for 5 years, so by the time I took my private check ride, it was such a weird situation to be sitting there across the table from a guy I just met who's asking me questions about airplanes. And I knew the answers. It was just such an odd, weird environment. It's like the first time we take a knowledge test. We've taken tests all our lives, like we know how to take a test, but the first time you take a knowledge test is the first time you've taken an FAA test, probably. And that's why practicing FAA questions is a good idea. That's why, I mean, in a 141 environment, you have that built in, but in a Part 61 environment, if you have the ability to fly with multiple instructors, you totally should, just to get the perspective, just to have the experience of flying with someone else, particularly when it comes to evaluation. And I think one of the things that we do at Polk, we have monthly flight student meetings where we bring everybody together, and at one of those meetings during each semester, I bring in our DPE population that test our students primarily, or I invite everybody to come. And it's just an opportunity for the student to meet the DPE in a non-evaluation setting, like, hi, my name is Joe, whatever, how are you doing? What kind of car do you drive? I mean, simple, like, conversational questions, so that when you are sitting in that room with that person, you don't feel like it's the Spanish Inquisition, and it's somebody you know. You've met this person before, you've had a conversation. And I know that's not, maybe to the point of your question, Eric, like a resource to go and study, but I see people, and even when in the stage checks and of course exams that I do, it's they fail probably 80% of the time, not because they didn't know the material, but because they freaked out and said something dumb, or followed a dumb statement instead of saying, you know what, that's not right, let me look that up. Because they just didn't approach the Checkride as a conversation about airplanes with another person. They viewed it as this, you know, I'm being grilled, and, you know, I may not live through this. And that's why I loved the title of this webinar, Surviving the Checkride. You know, like it's a firing squad. You know, answer one question wrong, we're taking you out. And I think that, honestly, that's the best resource I could tell somebody. Get to know the DPEs, fly with other pilots, get some of that apprehension bias off of your plate so that you're not dealing with that.
Sure.
Eric, I want to add on to this. You know, so one of the things I always tell applicants, and I know it's easy for me to say this ahead of time, is just imagine I'm your most annoying friend that doesn't know anything about flying. We sat down over dinner, and I'm just going to ask you a whole bunch of questions because I don't know this stuff. You know, that's really what this is we're not looking for, you know, an explanation of Bernoulli's principle to the physics level here. You know, we want some basic stuff that tells us about your knowledge base and can you do this? And if you think of it as a conversation more, as you said, more than the Spanish Inquisition, it's going to be a lot more comforting. You know, we're looking for some basic knowledge here. And I don't know if you've done this, Todd, but I actually have done stage checks for non-141 programs when, you know, I get an instructor that says, hey, I got a student that's coming up. Will you go fly with them before we send him to the Checkride? And I can't say, all right, well, today if we do all your maneuvers, wink, wink, to the standards, it'll count and you'll pass. And if you don't, it'll just be a stage check. But, you know, I can certainly, as an examiner, act as an instructor separately too. And I can come in, we can sit down, go through some stuff, test your knowledge. And if things aren't there, you know, you say, look, I'm going to take 3 or 4 more weeks to prep. If you say, hey, things are looking pretty good, maybe you take a couple extra flights and we send you to a Checkride. And there are many examiners that will serve that role as a you know, kind of a check along the way also, if somebody wants them to do that and their instructor works with them on that.
Great advice for sure. Todd, let me, I want to come to Todd Ritchie for a second. I want to actually come back to something you mentioned in your first response, Todd, and you talked about the process that, you know, DPE goes through in preparing to administer a Checkride and creating a plan of action. So can you talk in a little more detail about how you go about doing that? You know, should the applicants be expecting essentially the kind of same old Checkride from Todd Ritchie or Jason Blair, or are they going to see subtle differences, you know, even for the same certification level? And if so, kind of what factors influence what your game plan would be on a particular Checkride?
Sure. Well, I think every examiner is going to have a little different angle on how they create their plan of action, but it's all going to be based off the airman certification standards as far as what tasks we know we need to cover and that sort of thing, which why it's so important to be familiar with the ACSs, which we've mentioned several times this evening, or PTS if that's applicable. As far as the plan of action goes, it's basically, for those who's not familiar with that, it's basically an outline for me as the evaluator to make sure that I'm covering everything I need to cover with the particular applicant. And it is right out of the ACS. So what I typically like to do is make it a kind of a scenario, maybe more of a realistic type of kind of a conversation, like Jason mentioned, and not so formal, but hey, I'm your buddy, I don't know anything about flying, let's talk, and try to have a good conversation and just see where they're at. So as far as the scenario goes, I'll start with pre-flight. Well, there is some rote stuff involved. There's some regulations that we need to know, currency and that sort of thing. But as soon as we get that stuff knocked out, and most people know those things, they've been well prepared for that portion. And then we'll get into, I like to call them like what if situations, or, there we were, what would we do if this situation happened? And just kind of see where the applicant's at and what they've been taught as far as decision making, and what are our options, what's a plan B if we need it, when do I make a plan B, and stuff like that. So I know we'll probably get into this a little bit later, Eric, but I think my plan of action's typically about an hour and a half long, give or take. It depends on what conversations get spurred on different things, but I hope that helps, and I hope that answers your question. Is there anything else that you were looking for on that?
No, that definitely helps. I want to move over to Jason Blair for a second. Could you maybe address, I guess, some factors, and maybe one example, and this comes from a specific question that was submitted, written exam results. So can you kind of speak to how, say, for example, written exam results, or really any other external factors, how that kind of factors in, or how that might modify the plan a bit?
I sure can, and this is one of those things that everybody kind of looks at and goes, well, if I do really, really good and get a 99%, the examiner is going to make my check ride easier. But if I do 72%, maybe my check ride is going to get really hard. And I can't tell you that is the case for most examiners. What we do have to do is, when we build our plans of action, this is actually why most of the time the examiners will ask you for your FTN number ahead of time, so we can actually see what those knowledge test results were when we look at your application in IACRA. And we do have to make sure we incorporate review of the areas that were found to be what we'll call deficient on the knowledge testing, where we got something wrong. We don't know the specific questions, but we know the topic areas by looking at the codes on that knowledge test. So that is something that we will go ahead and review, and and look a little bit more in detail. I won't lie, as an examiner, if I look and see it was the NDB questions on the IFR test here, and unfortunately they're gone now, but not too long ago they were still there. I didn't put a whole lot of faith in digging into those. There are things we put more weight on than others based on current and relevant types of flying we're doing. But we will also modify the test based on what kind of aircraft you're going to be bringing and some of those knowledge test results. I can't tell you it's going to get harder or easier. We do have the same things we need to cover, but we do actually review those pieces prior to giving the test and make sure that if there were areas that were found to be knowledge deficient, that we are going to cover them. With that said, most of us examiners understand that there are still test preparatory materials out there, and a good person spending some time memorizing can probably get a 99% and not know a great base of knowledge, while somebody who had a 78% but studied it all without preparatory materials and actually just read the material and learned it, might actually end up being a better applicant and a better pilot, from a knowledge-based standpoint in the end anyway.
Thanks, Jason. Eric, would you have something to add to that? And I know, in your setting, in the collegiate environment, in the 141 world, you're administering a lot of kind of end of stage examinations or evaluations prior to stage check, and a lot of these same concepts hold true. Can you speak to some of those external influences?
Sure. I think that, the main thing I'm going to look for when I'm looking at a plan of action, particularly for an end of course, but then also I think for a stage check. A stage check, especially for those of you that are listening that are not familiar with the 141 world. So a stage check is sort of an incremental check along the way to focus on the last group of material covered in your lesson, so that you're ready for the next set, really, to make sure that you're ready to move on. That gives us a unique opportunity to drill down at a level that we might not drill down to when it comes time for the end of course, just by virtue of how much material we have to cover. I like to look at accident trends. I like to look at a safety report. We have a voluntary safety reporting program. And so if I see, for example, in a semester, if my safety team tells me that, we're seeing reports of pilots having issues getting lost at the airport, maybe we're having an issue like where we took a clearance from ATC, but we turned on the wrong taxiway. Then I'm going to be asking questions specifically about, okay, so let's say you're here and air traffic control told you to do this. How would you navigate with that? When I get in the airplane, I want to see that this pilot has an airport diagram, readily accessible, so they can show me, brief me, where are we going? And so I would fuel some of my, I guess, my focus areas around the issues that I knew that existed. And that's one of the benefits of sort of working in that school environment. I think from a DP perspective, I'm not a DP, and I never have been, but I think the hardest part that from my perspective about being a DP is not knowing the student until you sit down with them. And really that first 10 to 15 minutes is you trying to figure out sort of what their background is and how much do they actually know, and are they just nervous? And most of them are. I think one of the benefits that we have in the 141 environment, particularly in a school environment like that, is that you do know the students, maybe not like their instructors do, certainly not, but you do have a background knowledge on them already. So especially if if I am doing an end of course, I'm going to talk to the check instructor who did the stage 3 exam and say, hey, how did this go? Like I see the notes here in the lesson record, but well, he was a little bit weak on airspace, particularly getting in and out of class Bravo. Like, I mean, he could do it, but he was a little weak on it. Well, then obviously I'm going to focus on that because I want to make sure that that hole's been closed up by the time we get to an EOC. So I think in that environment, it's a little bit different because you do have a little bit more opportunity to know the individual student and to focus on the areas you should be focusing on. So that they're ready when they go to. I want my students to walk into a Checkride and say, man, that was the easiest flight I've ever taken. That my standards as a school administrator should be so high that when they go to the FAA test and they're only held to that standard, they should come out of that saying, well, except for being nervous, that was a piece of cake. That's what I want for the student.
Eric, you gave some great, speaking of, the typical Checkride jitters and nervousness, you gave what I thought was just some excellent insight and advice, and you talked about opportunities to meet the examiner ahead of time, and you talked about how it can throw people off their game just a bit if they're seeing someone brand new for the first time. In other words, if they had worked with the same instructor for years or months or whatever the case may be. Let me maybe direct this one back to Todd Ritchie for a second. Todd, when you clearly see an applicant come before you who maybe is meeting you for the first time and is you can see is visibly nervous or distraught or whatever the case may be, do you have some, I guess, strategies or techniques, other advice that you can either share now or that maybe you would share in that particular case on a Checkride that you would pass along that to help relax the applicants?
Sure. Well, I think Jason hit on a good point earlier. I would definitely recommend, especially a Part 61 applicant, if they could fly a mock stage check or a mock check ride with a different instructor, maybe an instructor they've never flown with before. I think that's a good intro to, okay, I need to perform for this guy that I've never met, and I think that would prepare them just a little bit better for when they meet with the DPE. But the first 5 minutes, when we're having some small talk, I try to. I've been on the other end of the table too, and I've been nervous, and so I try to, hey, tell me about yourself, and try to make it as light as we can. Get them to loosen up a little bit if it works. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But just try to have some small talk, make sure they know how the check ride's going to go. We brief the outcomes of the check ride. I always throw in on my first 5 minutes, hey, I don't expect you to be perfect today on everything. Nobody knows everything about everything, including myself. So hopefully I try to throw in little phrases like that just to make them maybe a little bit more comfortable. And I don't know if it works or not, but it seems like it does for the most part. But So that's kind of some of my method to my madness. Jason, do you have any good ones?
I think one of the best pieces of advice, I mean, you kind of get in this mindset as an applicant that I have to sit here and keep answering questions until the examiner stops. There is absolutely nothing wrong with saying, hey, can I take about a 5-minute break here and grab a drink of water and go use the restroom? We don't want to see you take a walk outside and call your instructor and see if you can get answers for the question we just gave you. But taking just a couple minutes to stand up, walk around, get a drink of water, clear your head a little bit can really help as an applicant as you're going through it. And it's something even when I take check rides now, we still get them as examiners on a regular basis. And if we do any advanced training, we get them. There's nothing wrong with taking a quick little break. And, especially if you're thinking something like a CFI check ride, I mean, those grounds regularly go 4 to 5 hours. And it's not that we're trying to, just find everything we can as an examiner to trip you up. There's just a lot of things to cover when we do an advanced check ride like that. So, a couple minutes every hour here worth of break it really goes a long ways to kind of quelling your nerves a little bit and settling you back down. And if nothing else, if you've been explaining stuff to the examiner, wetting your mouth a little bit and getting a drink, just kind of stops that dry mouth moment and lets you breathe for a moment or two. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that.
Jason, you gave some great advice before, I think, that fits the same category about getting past the check ride jitters or the nervousness, and that was the scenario you described of pretending that you're sitting down with a buddy at the dinner table and they don't know anything about aviation. They just want to ask you a lot of questions and kind of keep it conversational and talk about what you know. There's a questions pouring in related to I guess the negative way to ask the question would be, what would I have to do to fail a check ride, right? And that's going to be difficult. So maybe I'll put a different spin on it. What do you do to pass a check ride? But I guess if you could maybe shed some light on, what you're looking for in terms of consistency. And there's definitely some questions we have that are very specific to, if I deviate on my altitude by more than 100 feet, is that, at face value a failure? So can you talk and maybe frame it around instrument check ride? Because I know a lot of these questions are people that are gearing up for instrument check rides and they're very nervous about specific altitudes and headings and those types of things. What would, in your opinion, constitute failure versus satisfactory performance for pass?
Sure, and there's certainly subjective moments and there's objective moments, and we have some specific standards that we do have to maintain. And obviously, if we look at the ACS on the instrument, we obviously can't let you go full scale deflection without doing anything about it. We obviously can't let you bust a minimum without doing anything about it. And some of this becomes situational. It's not uncommon for an examiner to say, all right, let's go grab approach X and make sure that you can check NOTAMs for it, because we've noticed there's a NOTAM raising the approach minimums by 140 feet because maybe there's a crane in the area. So we're looking for you to situationally piece that stuff together. If you're off as you're in the en route section by 50 feet, and you look at the examiner and say, hey, I took a little bit of a bump there. I'm going to go ahead and correct this back down and put myself back on the altitude. That's not going to be a bust. That's just part of being a really good pilot and correcting the things that, we all have errors happen when we're flying. And there are certainly points where we have to be a little bit more diligent. There are things we can't bust. If you find yourself got a bad vector and you're going to blow through the final approach on an LPV for a GPS, and you say, look, I'm going to go ahead and call ATC and ask for a revector here instead of trying to save this at the last minute, that's going to be a great decision. We're going to go around and we're going to fix it and do it again. Now, obviously, we can't have you get revectored 14 times in a row, but if you're doing what needs to be done as a good pilot, that's going to go a really long ways with any examiner who understands that you're in control of the aircraft, you're in control of the situation, you're making good decisions, and you're not just letting things happen. They're going to put you in an unsafe position. That's really what makes us worried as examiners if we start seeing tendencies that indicate you're not going to be a safe pilot after we send you out on this check ride.
Todd, anything to add there?
I think Jason hit a lot of it. And this goes for any check ride, not just instrument, but the ACS tells us as evaluators, and there's a lot of judgment on the evaluator part, but consistently exceeds from any tolerances in the skill. If it's a steep turn and you lose 120 feet, but you get it back, that's fine. It's not a fail, in my opinion, and the ACS's opinion. So, and I would stress to any applicants listening, if you do, and I'll just use a steep turn for example, if you do mess up on one, or you're not having your best day, but you get back within tolerances. Don't let that affect the rest of your check ride. If we're pressing on to stalls or whatever the case may be next, I've seen that a lot where people get kind of down on themselves because they didn't do it perfectly. I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for ACS standards. So keep that in mind. Don't let that mess up your next maneuver, because then it tends to be a little bit of a snowball effect if you think you're not doing well. But that's pretty much it. I think Jason hit most of the points on that one.
Todd, I need to use that same advice for my golf game, not carrying that last bad putt to the next tee box. That would help tremendously. Eric Crump, tell me about what you're seeing trend-wise in kind of the whole EFB craze, the paper versus paperless, and do you have policies at your school? Do you have DPEs in the area that are necessarily requiring some version rather than the other? I know we have a lot of questions related to what's acceptable. Will certain DPEs absolutely require paper charts versus, iPad, for example?
Sure. First, can I throw one comment on that last question?
Please.
Okay. The one thing I see it, and maybe Jason and Todd see this too, something goes bad and the applicant gives up. Like, if I haven't said the word unsatisfactory, you're not done yet. So it's not, something happens and like, well, that was 150 feet, but it's over. Like, no, don't do that. I want to see that that when adversity strikes, you can get back on path. So until I say it's unsat, it's not unsat. So don't stop. Keep fixing the problem. The last thing on earth I want to see from an applicant is just a giver-upper, because that's somebody I'm really going to have some serious concern about. Because if something bad happens, well, I guess that's it. Well, I'm done. I'm just going to sit here and watch and see what happens. I mean, I want to see that you're going to keep fighting and that you're going to fix it. So that's the only thing else I'd add to what those guys were saying. Don't give up.
Good advice.
On the EFB question, I will say from the ACS perspective, we were exceedingly careful to make sure that we made it extremely clear in the document that either paper or electronic is fine. Okay, we didn't say that you had to do it one way or another, but we made it very clear that no examiner should be telling you can't bring your iPad to a check ride. That should not happen. There's no reason for that to happen. If it does happen, then that's an issue that hopefully you can work out with the examiner, and if not, then we need to get some more people involved in it. That's certainly not the intent of the ACS to require one method or another. If you want to plan stuff on paper and you understand it and you can present it to your evaluator and it meets the ACS standard, that's great. If you're going to come in with an iPad and you're going to explain the exact same information and you understand how to do it, that's great too. The problem that I see, and I think this was more when the ACS was first coming out, particularly with private, you'd have students, and we saw this even with the BTS, but you'd see students who would come to the check ride, again, because somebody had told them that it had to be paper, you couldn't bring your iPad. And so they'd come in having never used paper, or maybe seen it one time when they were preparing for their knowledge test, and then try to explain to me as an evaluator their flight plan, having never done a real paper navlog other than for this evaluation, and just tank it miserably. Because, and I will go back to the name of the thing that we're doing. This is a practical test. Practically, if you fly the airplane with an iPad as your primary reference for information, then bring your practical device to the practical test. If you practically do it with paper, bring that to the test. But I'm expecting that your chart data is going to be accurate. All the same requirements still exist, whether it's electronic or paper. And from an evaluator's perspective, and I'm interested to hear what Jason and Todd have to say about this, it doesn't matter to me. All I care about is that when I ask you the questions I need to ask you, you can explain to me the information I need and it meets the ACS standard. Then when we get in the airplane and we're going to that first checkpoint and I give you a diversion and I ask you, how long is it going to take? How much fuel are we going to burn? And how many miles are you going to cover? That you can give me an answer that you can support with data. I don't care how you did it. I just care that you met the standard.
I'd love to add on to this, guys. This is something that's actually relevant to a couple practical tests I've even had recently. And I'll add, even as examiners, we have specifically been given instruction by the designee standardization branch that basically says, thou shalt allow your applicants to bring digital charts. Now, it is also certainly within the wheelhouse of questions we can ask to say, so what happens if your iPad battery died? What are you going to do as a backup? And we're looking for you to have some sort of a solution for that. It might be, hey, I've got an iPhone as well. It might be, I've got some paper charts in the back that I can grab. It might be, I'm going to call ATC, get an ASR, but I need to see that you have some sort of solution. And it's interesting, I can't tell you I've ever failed somebody for not having a backup, but I have seen even recently that turn into a situation where a failure resulted. I had an applicant on an instrument check ride, and of nothing that I did, he left his iPad on the dashboard and it overheated. And there we were, 3 miles from the final approach fix. He picked up his charts and the iPad was overheated, and he said, well, what do I do now? I said, well, you're the PIC, go ahead and figure it out. In the end, he continued past the final approach fix, didn't descend, asked for a revector, and we were in a Cirrus, and as he went around to continue, he oversped the flaps. So, we have now exceeded a tolerance for the aircraft. So was it the iPad that caused the failure? No, not really. It was the fact that he did something else, but that caused the chain of events in the check ride. So, we've seen it go bad, but I've also seen it go the absolute fantastic way too, where somebody understands the limitations of their device, which is actually a testing item that we have in the ACSs now. If somebody is going to be using digital devices, it's fair to ask them, how do you know if you have current data? How do you know, if the device is legally able to be used in the aircraft, which most are for private flying, and how do you know how to get data out of that machine? So it actually opens up some of the questioning, and in some cases, if we think about replanning en route, if I ask an applicant on an instrument check ride or private check ride to plan a cross country for me, boy, doing it on the iPad, if I say, hey, I want to change my route a little bit here, it gets a lot easier than it would have been in the old days if I'd have said the same thing with a low and route chart in the middle of the air and made you start drawing lines and pull that plotter out as you try and fly the aircraft. So it's a really interesting time we live in with the data that we have on these. And if you have an examiner who's telling you, no, you can't use these on the check ride, I think it's time to ask for a little discontinuance of the check ride and maybe reevaluate how that's going to go. And the examiner's probably going to have to work with the skills a little bit so that they know you can as well.
Todd, what would you, what are the trends you're seeing right now in paper versus EFB use?
I think I'm seeing mostly both. So I'm seeing folks sit down with an iPad with a paper backup, which I think is the perfect scenario. That's just my opinion, obviously not ACS derived, but if you're going to be an iPad guy or an EFB guy, make sure that you pre-flight your device and make sure it's got everything that you think you might need for that flight. And I ask that in the ground portion of the check ride if I see the applicant utilizing a certain app or whatever they like to use. Another thing I see a lot too, especially like in a diversion exercise, is the student immediately goes heads down on their iPad and they're tapping away, and then every once in a while they tap something they don't want. And it turns into a little bit of a distraction. So be careful with that, because remember, you have to fly the airplane first. So as they're trying to get us to plan B, we're descending at 500 feet a minute and we're in a 30-degree right bank. So, be careful with that as you're going to use your iPad. I'm all for it. I think it's definitely the wave of the future, and it's, in my opinion, a lot safer. You just make sure you know how to use it and it's going to work properly, and you need a plan B for sure.
Eric, I want to add one piece to this, because I vividly remember a flight with you and Hal and I. There is an exception to the number of backups, because I do remember a flight where I had 2 iPads, and between you and Hal and I, there were 7 on the flight. You don't need to carry that many. A reasonable backup's probably enough as well.
Thanks for that, Jason. I want to switch topics for just a second. Several questions related to, and this, I really see this as almost inevitable in a particular check ride scenario, but a question you get stumped on, a question the applicant is stumped with, how best to handle that scenario, what type of response should, the applicant go right to different sources of information they could reference? Do they put their hands up? You know, what's the best advice for handling? Eric, would you like to start with that one?
I guess I can, yeah. Geez, I mean, I'll go back to what you just said, which is where I left off a minute ago. Don't give up. Work the problem. Don't stop. I mean, I think one of the real advantages of testing applicants the way that we do is that we get to see how the applicant responds to things that are unexpected, right? We get to see, I mean, there's some things that are just, I'm going to ask you a question about Class C airspace and you got to give me an answer. But then there are so many opportunities in the airplane, whether we're talking about technology, we're talking about maneuvers, there's so many opportunities for the applicant to be in a situation that even me as the evaluator, I had no idea that was going to happen. And we get to evaluate that. And so, I mean, I'm going to hinge on please don't stop. Don't give up. I need to see that you're still going. And I'll probably chime in with the other two, but that's the first thing that pops in my head.
Jason, it probably happened to you today because I know you gave a couple of check rides where there's probably you probably had a question that maybe stumped the applicant. How was that handled?
You know, it happens regularly. In some cases, the examiner's even purposefully doing that. And I'll absolutely say the best advice is not to make up something new and try and stump the examiner and think you're going to fool them. Most of us don't ask questions we don't know the answers to. So you're probably not going to fool us on it. So, you know, use resources, and this is a practical test. I mean, you can't call your instructor and just ask them for the answer, but in some cases, I'll even let you get a Google. You know, this is a practical thing. If I say, look, you know, we came out to the airplane at our cross-country location, and I see we have a flat tire. Can you change that? You know, okay, well, you might know that there are some owner maintenance things you can do, but it's perfectly reasonable to say, look, I don't have that list memorized. If I thought I had to change my tire, I'd probably go find it, pull out your FARs, and go see if that's something you can do. And sometimes finding those resources is a very valid thing for us to see. Can you resource, you know, an answer to this and find the right way to solve the problem if there's something there, instead of just making it up on the fly on your own? You know, I think that's perfectly reasonable to say, look, I've got some FAA, you know, resources here. I'd like to reference this, and we can't have you doing that on everything. But there are things, you know, certainly as examiners, we don't know it all either. We know many times where to find things, and that's a valid answer to a question. If you aren't certain on something, tell us, look, I'm not certain, but I think I know where to find that. Let me see if I can find the reference point for you and dig it up and find us the right answer.
Todd, anything to add to those responses?
I think they hit the nail on the head. I usually include that in my briefing before we kind of start things rolling. I'll say, hey, if something comes up, you don't know what the answer is, you know, I'd prefer you don't make something up. Just be honest with me. Tell me you don't know it, but I want you to find out, you know, where we can do it. And I think Jason alluded to this. That kind of tells me some things too. If it's a systems question and they say, no, I need to look it up, you know, and it takes them 10 minutes to find the systems chapter, then that tells me, well, maybe they haven't spent a lot of time in the POH. So then it kind of turns into a different direction. So there's things there, but certainly, like Eric said, don't give up. You know, what would you do after the check ride if something came up and you weren't sure what it was? Is you would look it up in all those books that you purchased, you know, or definitely Google is a good resource sometimes too. But don't give up.
And I think word vomiting too is an issue. Like if I ask you what is VY for this airplane, I just want you to give me a number. If I ask you when you would use best rate of climb speed versus best angle of climb speed, I'm expecting like a sentence. If I say, how does the hydraulic system work, I'm expecting a paragraph. But when I ask you a rote memorization, like I'm expecting a number, and you start telling me about service ceiling, and we go into an explanation of L over D max. It's like, okay, that's great that you know all of that stuff, but that's not what I asked. Listen to the question, I think, is part of that. Listen to what the evaluator is asking for and answer what was asked. Don't try to go, and I see this happen where a student gets a question and they were ready for that question, man. They were ready. They studied, 300 pages on that one question. And so when I ask, man, here comes this flood, I call it word vomit, of just everything that you ever wanted to know. I'm like, okay, that's great. we just spent 40 minutes asking one question. So I've still got to ask you all the other questions. So just don't, listen to the question and where it's coming from, and just try to answer the question the way it's asked. And if you don't know, ask. All the time, I ask a question. This happens to me on a regular basis. I'll ask an applicant a question, and the applicant goes, I have no idea what that means. Okay, let me ask it a different way. What the other side is the applicant starts trying to answer a question that they didn't understand. Okay? I would much rather you just say, Eric, I'm not really clear. Are you asking me this, or are you asking me this? Give me the chance to clarify. I'm a human being too. Maybe it doesn't make sense. And again, that goes back to that conversation that we were talking about before. Let's do this together. It's a team effort.
Sure. It's hard to believe that we are approaching our hour time frame, but there is one more topic that I wanted to give each of our panelists an opportunity to respond to. This is maybe even a bit unsettling that we had as many questions or comments related to this as we did, and I will fully acknowledge that possibly many of these are hypotheticals. However, there certainly appear to be some cases out there where applicants have had some not so pleasant interactions with examiners, or maybe examiners behaving in ways that they didn't fully expect. There's one anecdote out there about an examiner who was almost distracting, it seems like, because in addition to the evaluation piece, for this applicant, they felt the examiner was always looking or wanted to teach kind of at the end of even if a maneuver was performed within standards, they seem to always want to be teaching through each of these maneuvers as well. And then other cases where they felt that the examiner was maybe acting in a rude manner in even one instance, or a couple of instances when we've heard of requests for items to be demonstrated that aren't anywhere in the ACS or PTS, whatever the case may be. So I guess this all falls into the broad category of what is your best advice on how an applicant should respond to these cases that are a little bit out of the norm or a little bit unorthodox on the part of the examiner. And Jason, how about we start with you?
Sure, and this is, what we probably kind of generally term as examiners behaving badly. And there are certainly cases where that has happened, and we certainly try and find those to the best of our ability, which means as an applicant, if you find, your examiner is asking you to demonstrate an ILS on your private pilot Checkride, we have a problem, and we need to know about that. There are mechanisms for actually reporting that through your local flight standards office. And if you're uncomfortable with that, there's actually an email address that can be used to the national level that goes to the designee standardization branch, and they will follow up on that as well. And it's an anonymous type of reporting that's done. It's not necessarily completely anonymous. It's held in secure confidence by those in Oklahoma City, not necessarily even passed along to the FSDO who or what that complaint was. So it's important if we find these things, and we are doing a really good job, with the FAA and the industry of trying to make sure that we have standardized examiners that are following those procedures. So if you do see something, either the applicant or their instructor really does need to reach out to either the local office or a national office and say, hey, look, we've got an issue here. Now, there's always sometimes some discrepancy, and it's tough sometimes even as an examiner to give a good, thorough debrief, especially when somebody has been issued a disapproval and have that knowledge conveyed. So what we really many times try and do is also debrief an instructor if we found things that were problematic, to make sure that the learning does continue. And that's really what this is, it's a learning check when we give a practical test, and we shouldn't be teaching on it, which sometimes makes it a little bit awkward for the applicant, not to expect that we're going to be teaching you on the Checkride. It's either satisfactory or unsatisfactory, and you may be very used to getting some of that feedback, and many of us as examiners find it hard to do. We have experience and knowledge, and if we see something you want to try and jump in and say, hey, that's a good steep turn, but you could do this and fix it a little bit. And that's not really what we're there to do. That might be something we could do at another time. But we are all instructors too, and we many times instruct on the side of Checkrides, and it's hard sometimes to get ourselves out of that mindset. So it should really just be a testing environment. And if there are things that are happening outside of that, and if the examiner is not focusing on that test, and doing it properly, that's something we do need to have a conversation about. And we're all guilty of a little bit here and there. So if an examiner has an odd phone call that comes in, they should excuse themselves from it, maybe give everybody a break, but they shouldn't be doing 15 phone calls during a practical test. We shouldn't be doing a practical test in the middle of the FBO with people coming in and out. This should be a focused thing, and if your examiner's not doing that, we do need to know about it.
Eric, do you have some comments to add?
It's not here where I am now, but in a previous FSDO, we had a DPE who unsatted an applicant for passed the oral, everything was fine, went out to do the pre-flight, and before they actually got in the airplane, the applicant just noticed, it's like, this wind seems like it's picked up. So the applicant checked the weather again, and the weather had changed. There was a cold front that was coming, wasn't anywhere close, and he thought that they could have gotten the check ride done, but he looked at the weather again, and the weather certainly was within the limitations, not limitations, but within the crosswind component listed in the POH for the aircraft. But the applicant, knowing it was a private check ride and seeing that, several students who were coming into the airport were actually going around because they were having a hard time with the landings, he said, what, look at the weather's just beyond a point where I feel comfortable with the flight. I think, we should discontinue and, pick it up another time. And so in the applicant's mind, he made a safety of flight call, and the evaluator unsatted him for it because he said, the weather conditions were perfectly fine, and they were within the limitations of the aircraft, and that anybody who was a private pilot should have been able to fly in those conditions. And in that case, the applicant obviously didn't agree, and the instructor, who I knew personally, didn't agree, and they did exactly what they're supposed to. They went to the FSDO. They, took the issue up there. It turned into, a very civilized conversation between the examiner and the FSDO and the applicant and the instructor. They came to terms, and ultimately the unsat was overturned because the applicant made a perfectly acceptable discontinuance call based on weather, and the examiner had no grounds to unsat the check ride for it. So I think when things like that, I don't know that that's necessarily even an examiner behaving badly. The guy thought that he was doing the right thing. The applicant thought he was doing the right thing. I think this is really where we have to approach this like adults, and we have to communicate. We need to follow the rules, use the process for what it's intended for, and let the system work the way that it's designed to work. I mean, these things do happen, but I think the main thing is communication and just again being an adult about it.
Todd, anything to add?
I'll be quick because I know we're kind of pressed on time. I agree absolutely 100% with everything with Jason and Eric said. I think most DPEs out there, they want to see you succeed in your check ride. I know I want to, but I think it boils down to you're kind of the customer. So if you're not happy with what that DPE did, as long in reference to the standards and what he's allowed and not allowed to do, I would certainly raise that flag to your instructor, and that if it needs to go to maybe the chief instructor and then ultimately to the FSDO to stop that behavior, whatever it may be, because you don't want that that particular examiner to be doing those certain things to other applicants. That needs to be addressed, and a lot of times it would just be a quick phone call from a FSDO and say, hey, maybe let's relax on this, or let's try a different angle on this particular thing, and then usually it's solved. But I absolutely would raise the flag on that if you think something was not fair. Absolutely.
Todd, thank you for that. I also now, since we have slightly exceeded our time, I want to offer a big thank you on behalf of all the attendees tonight, Mr. Todd Ritchie, Mr. Eric Crump, Mr. Jason Blair. A lot of great insight, a lot of very valuable experience that you all possess, and we're certainly all grateful for you taking some of that valuable time away to share that with all of us on the webinar presentation tonight. I want to recap or mention 3 themes that I felt really came through tonight with many of the responses from our panel. Number 1 being, do your homework, do your research. It's not cheating to be well prepared. You heard a lot about ACS, how that has evolved, what to expect on the check ride. Know the examiner's playbook. Take the opportunity, if it's presented, if you have it, to meet the examiner. Kind of moving into a second theme, some training diversity. I know it's not possible for every person in every scenario, but if you do have the opportunity to fly with someone else so that your first experience with that is not in the Checkride scenario with the examiner, you should absolutely do that. That will certainly have you feeling and have you better prepared on Checkride day. And kind of a third theme, much easier said than done, but try to relax a little bit, and kind of subcategories to that. Treat it as a conversation. Careful about the word vomiting. That's a new term I learned tonight from Eric Crump. Answer the questions as they're presented. Have a conversation with the examiner, and maybe most importantly, absolutely don't give up. Checkride is not finished until the examiner says it's finished. So absolutely keep working the problem. Find a solution, work through it. You are the PIC, and that is exactly what those examiners are looking for tonight. Final reminders about what we mentioned before, that the webinar recording, if you wish to come back to any of the topics that will be up tomorrow, sporties.com/webinars, and also on the Sporties YouTube channel. So please check back with us. We hope to see you again on a future presentation. Again, for Todd Ritchie, Eric Crump, and Jason Blair, I'm Eric Radke, and very much appreciate everyone joining us tonight. Have a great evening and fly safe.